Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining. Um, I will pass it on over to Mary and Mila.
Mila, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no,
Um,
no, no, no. It's phonetically you were correct. It's just my mom liked Mila better. Hi everyone. I'm so glad that you're here with us tonight. It's great to be with you. My name is Mila Tappan. I am Fame's Education Affordability Content and Training Manager, and with me tonight is Mary Dyer. And Mary is Fame's Education Affordability and Financial Wellness Manager, and we worked together for like 20 some years. And so we're very excited to be here tonight. Just tell you a little bit about Fame. Fame is a quasi state agency, meaning we're not state employees, but we work very closely with the state. And what the work that Mary and I do is really just focused on making sure people know how to pay for higher education, helping them navigate the financial aid process, and making sure that people are financially well, that regardless of how much money people have now or how much they make in the future, they just feel really confident about, the role of money in their lives and how to manage it so that it works for them and not vice versa. So tonight, what we are going to do is we are going to talk about these things, but we would love to have questions. So I just want you to know that questions are incredibly welcomed. You can put them in the chat. Mary's going to watch the chat so that if there are questions, she'll either answer them or I will stop periodically and she'll let me know if there are questions that I should be addressing. So please, we'd much prefer this be a two-way street. So please share any thoughts that you have as well. If we use acronyms or I say things that just don't make sense, just back me up and say, hey, can you hold on for a second? And I want to be sure that you get what you need out of tonight's session. So we're going to talk a little bit about financial aid offers, reviewing and comparing them. But then we're going to spend time talking about options to pay the remaining balance. We're going to talk about this piecemeal approach that we use a lot in our work. We're going to talk about some of those other pieces like scholarship and savings and tuition payment plans. We're going to talk about a couple of next steps, things that you need to be doing to make sure that you actually get that money once you've decided where you're going to go to school and feel like you're almost done with the financial aid part of the process, a couple steps left, and then we're going to talk about special circumstances or appeals. Okay? So, with that, let's start by talking about financial aid offers. I know kind of where we are in time. Friday is May 1st. Some of you have maybe already made your decisions about where you're going to go to school, maybe even paid your deposits. But just in case you haven't, or even if you had, I just want to back us up a little bit and talk about financial aid offers. If you received multiple financial aid offers, it's probably no shock what I'm going to say next, which is every offer is very different. It looks different. Different schools have different layouts of their offers. Different schools include different pieces of information. Obviously, different schools offer you different amounts of financial aid, and even the way in which they deliver it to you might be different. I wish every school would still send a paper award letter or award offer, but what we find is that some schools increasingly are sending you an email and telling you to check your student portal. So we recognize all of those scenarios exist. But I did want to call attention to some things that are on the financial aid offer that are really important for you to know about and understand what the terms even mean. And as I joked about, Mary and I have been doing this for a lot of years. But we try to remind ourselves, and we've had our own kids go through this process, that this is all brand new to all of you. So don't feel like it's, a situation where you can't ask questions or don't feel embarrassed if you don't know about something. I wouldn't expect that you do. And you are going to go off to school and probably learn about things that I will have no idea about. So, please ask us any questions that you do have. So, when we talk about things on a financial aid offer, one of the things that you might see are what we call direct costs. So, this is just a sample financial aid offer, but you can see here that under direct costs, you're going to see the things that are going to be billed to you by the school. So, the most common are going to be your tuition and fees. Not usually your books and supplies, but in some scenarios it could be. And then potentially on campus housing if you're planning to live on campus. Those direct costs that are billed to you are things that you often have very little impact over. So you can't control the cost of tuition. You might have a couple of housing options, but they kind of just put before you what those costs are going to be. But then there are all these other, what we call indirect costs or expenses. And these are expenses that aren't billed by the school, but they are expenses that you have in order to go to school. And the good news is that schools do recognize that it does cost you more than just the price of tuition and fees. Again, you're going to have your living expenses, whether that's going to be on campus and billed by the school, or maybe you're living off campus in an apartment, or maybe even with your family. But that doesn't mean you don't still have some expenses. There are, again, your books and supplies are usually what I think of as an indirect expense. You can have like travel expenses and just other miscellaneous expenses. So the good news again is that the schools do recognize those expenses. So one of the very first things you want to do is get a handle on what those expenses look like. That's before any financial aid. And then there's going to be the financial aid that the schools have offered you, and that's going to vary by school. But the best types of funds are what we call gift aid, and that consists of grants and scholarships. And grants and scholarships are the best types of aid because those are funds that don't have to be repaid. Grants usually are based on your family's financial situation, and scholarships might still be based somewhat on your financial situation, but there's usually more to it than that. For example, some of you might have received merit scholarships, and those merit scholarships were offered to you by the admissions office just based on your admissions application and the fact you were a great student in high school. So that's a type of scholarship, and we'll talk more about scholarships in a little bit. Some schools also offer tuition or housing waivers. So those are all the best types of aid, and we're hoping for as much of that as possible. And then there's what they refer to as self-help aid. You'll see that listed on some financial aid offers. And what that basically means is it's not free money. There's something more to it. And so it's either a loan that has to be repaid once you're finished with school or no longer enrolled half-time, or it might be work study. So let me just say a little bit about loans. We're going to talk a little about loans now and then just a little bit more about loans at the end. But you are going to find that typically a loan is going to be listed on your financial aid offer. That is going to be a federal direct loan. It might be subsidized or unsubsidized, and that is money that comes from the federal government. And you probably saw that $5,500 loan on every single one of your financial aid offers. That's the maximum amount that you can borrow as a first-year student. And then again, work study is a type of aid that you can also receive, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Okay, so those are the big pieces. The expenses you're going to be billed for, the expenses you still have, even though the school isn't billing you for them, and then you have your grant money and your scholarship money, your free money, and we hope for as much of that. And then there are some other types of aid that either have to be repaid or earned through a job. Now, here's just an example of another financial aid offer. The items I highlighted on that last one, those are things that I hope you see on every financial aid offer. Those are the really critical pieces of information, but sometimes they're missing. And then sometimes there are some additional pieces that I think help things make more sense. So here's an example of another offer. And one of the things you'll see on this offer is they included your student aid index. So a lot of times with this information here, you can find this in other places. So your student aid index, you actually could see that when you filed your FAFSA. So that is kind of that number that is the result of filing your free application for federal student aid. They took all of the information you put into the FAFSA and your parents put into the FAFSA, and they kind of boiled it down to this one number that schools will use to determine your eligibility. And that student aid index is the same at all of your schools, right? Because it was based on your FAFSA. Some letters or some offers will also have information like more on the loans. So, you can see here, this one also has federal direct loans listed. Again, there's usually a subsidized version and an unsubsidized portion, totaling 5,500 usually. You might have found that at one school you had more subsidized, and at another school you might have more unsubsidized. The school will figure out how much of each of those you have. But again, typically for a first-year student, that's going to total the maximum of 5,500. The subsidized is the better because no interest is going to accrue while you're in school. So what that means is that you are going to owe the same amount that you borrow. So if you borrow 55 or let's say 3,500 in a subsidized loan this year, when you get ready to go into repayment, you still only owe 3,500. The unsubsidized loan is the same, except that interest is accruing while you're in school. So you don't have to make payments on it. You can, but you don't have to. But if you don't make any payments on it, that loan that you borrow your first year is going to be bigger because of the interest when you go into repayment. Okay, so that's just a little bit about loans. We could do a whole session on loans, but you definitely want to learn more about them. And again, some of the loan offers or financial aid offers will have more details about these loans than others. And then on this particular letter, you're going to see that that talks about some of your other funding options. And this is what we're going to talk about in a minute. We're going to talk about, tuition payment plans and plus loans and private loans. Okay. And then last but not least, just one more financial aid offer that's designed a little bit differently and a few things I want to call attention to so that you can be looking at your financial aid offers and see if it has, if you have multiple offers, some of this information. What a lot of schools will do is they will put their assumptions on the financial aid offer. So they will let you know kind of what they assumed about you when they put together your financial aid offer. So for example, with this one, they're assuming that the student is living on campus, off campus, and that they're going to be enrolled full time. So it's going to be important to check your financial aid offers or information in your portal about what they're assuming. If they're assuming you're living on campus, are you actually planning to live on campus or vice versa? If they say that they believe you're going to be full time, are you going to be full time? Or maybe are you going to be not taking as many credits and be part time? So those are all options that you have, but the key piece is you just want to be sure that their assumptions line up with your reality. And if your reality is different than their assumptions, you want to let your financial aid office know as soon as possible so that if there are any adjustments that are required, they can make those, early in the process so that you don't get a surprise once school starts. Some other things that I just want to mention that are important too are notifications about things like work study. So a moment ago, I talked about work study being a type of financial aid that falls into that self-help category. And it's because in order to get work study, you have to have a job and work a certain number of hours and you're paid based on, whatever the hourly rate is for your job. So the big thing there's two big things I want you to know about work study. One is that work study money is not going to help you pay your first semester bill because you won't even get to campus and start earning that money until after your bill is due. Okay, so that's kind of the thing I want people to be aware of about work study. You know what's great about work study though is it's an awesome way to earn some money, but it's also a great way to make connections on campus. It's a way to meet new people. I was one of those people that I had a work study job all those years ago. I had a professor that I worked with. Long story short, I actually ended up getting my first job as a result of, connecting with that professor and working for him. So work study provides all sorts of great opportunities, but it does require you to find a job. And there's usually someone that's going to help you do that. There's an office on campus that can help with that. And then once you start working, you'll actually just get a paycheck. So it doesn't feel like financial aid in the same way that your grants and scholarships will. Okay, so those are some things on your financial aid offer. Again, it will vary depending on your financial aid offer, but those are the important things that I'd like you to go back and look at your offers and see what information you can find, unless you already feel like everything I said is like, oh, okay, yep, I know about that. Okay, if not, go and revisit those so that you are familiar with what's on those letters. Now, if you've gotten, and maybe some of you have already made your decisions, but if you've gotten multiple financial aid offers, one of the things that you might have found is that it's really hard to compare them. Even though I've been doing this for a long time, Mary's been doing this for a long time, if you put 3 financial aid offers in front of us, we're still going to use the worksheet that you see here, or at a minimum, we're going to take a piece of paper and a pencil and we're going to basically go through the math ourselves because we need to get that apples to apples comparison. Schools cost different amounts of money, they offer different amounts of financial aid. So, understanding how much a school really costs is important. One of the things that we see all the time is that sometimes a school that on the surface, with its sticker price, it looks to be more expensive. But after financial aid, it might be more affordable than a lower cost school. So, this is why this step in the process is so important. So, basically, what you want to get a sense of is how much does this school cost? What are they going to bill me? Those direct expenses. And then if I subtract out my grants and my scholarships before any loans, what is that net cost? And then what I want to do is I want to look at that across all of my schools. Now, I'm not saying people should always select the least expensive school, but at the same time, at least the families that we're working with, cost does matter. It does play into it. So it might not be the final decision maker, but you want to be sure that you're looking at your schools and you understand what they actually are going to cost you, so that you're factoring that in when you're making a decision about which school is the right fit for you. Academics, location, size of the school certainly matter, as well. But it's all of those things coming together and kind of balancing all of those things that's going to be so important. So this worksheet lives on our website. I know some of you might be from outside of Maine. You are free to use any of the resources on our website. So we'd love to have you check this out again to get that really good apples to apples comparison. And again, what you're going to see is that probably the loan amount is going to be the same for each school. So at the end of the day, the apples to apples is still probably going to look very similar, even after you build in your federal direct student loan, if you choose to borrow that. Okay, so how's everyone doing? All right. Any questions so far? You can just take yourself off mute if you have a question. Again, you can always put a question in the chat if you want, and Mary will take a look at it and she'll stop me or I'll stop periodically and answer it. Okay, thank you. Let's continue on then, and let's now look at, the kind of the next step in the process. So maybe you are someone who all of your costs are going to be covered by financial aid. I will say in reality, for many students, there is a remaining balance. So what we wanted to talk about next is how do you handle that remaining balance? So maybe, you've gotten a really good financial aid offer, but you still need to figure out what to do about the rest of it. So that's what we're going to talk about in this next section. So we're really big fans of the piecemeal approach to pay for higher education. And so the piecemeal approach is just this concept that ideally you don't want to rely on only one or two or three types of aid to pay for higher education. You want to have as many pieces as possible. And poor Mary has heard me say this gazillions of times over the years that I've used this analogy, but I want you to envision your pie, okay? It's Thanksgiving. 6, 8 months from now, whatever Thanksgiving is, and you've got your favorite pie. Mine happens to be pumpkin. Now, on Thanksgiving, if I want to cut my pie into 2 or 3 pieces, that's great because I'm happy to have a good old huge piece of pie. But when I'm paying for higher education, I don't want to have my pie into only 3 pieces because those pieces are going to be really large. Instead, what I want to have is as many pieces of pie as possible. And some of them might be really small, they might be just a sliver. But in combination with the other pieces, that's how you get your bill paid. And that's what we found to be the most effective way of families figuring out how to pay for higher education. So the more pieces you have, the better. So we've already talked about a couple of the pieces. So the need-based financial aid, that's what you got as a result of filing your FAFSA. So that's where maybe you got a Pell Grant, or if you're here in Maine, you might have gotten a Maine State Grant. Those are need-based types of aid. Technically, your loan, your federal student loan and work study are also need-based aid. Then there's our merit scholarships. And so some of you might have gotten a merit scholarship from the admissions office, again, based on your grades, not based on your family's financial situation. So that's great if you've got that as well. I will just say you also want to be sure, as I mentioned down below, kind of what's renewable. Regular need-based aid you have to apply for every year. But a merit scholarship from the admissions office, you might have found, as is typically the case, that you get to keep that merit scholarship year after year. You get it every single year as long as you like keep your grades at a certain GPA. So that's another really good thing about Merit Aid is that it you often can have it for more than 1 year. You don't have to reapply for it, in other words. Okay. And we talked a little bit about federal student loans. But here are some other pieces. So we are going to talk a little bit about private or outside scholarships that come from other sources. There's student savings, so we'll talk a little bit about that. There's student work study or earnings from other jobs, parent savings, contributions from other family members, monthly payment plans, or sometimes we refer to them as tuition payment plans, though they can cover more than tuition, tax credits even, and additional loans. So if you think about how many pieces we potentially have, you can see how even if your savings isn't huge, even a small amount can really make a difference in combination with these other types of financial aid or other sources of getting the bill paid. Now, what we see happen sometimes is that sometimes people will figure out a way to get their first year paid for. They will just really focus in on that first year. But what we also want to be sure of is that you're thinking about what about years 2, 3, and 4. So we don't want a situation where, you get through your first 2 years and then all of your resources have kind of dried up. And then you're like, how am I going to afford the rest of it? So be thinking about that now before you start. Is this sustainable, for 4 years or 2 years, depending on what your degree is going to be? And as I mentioned, you want to know kind of what funding is going to be renewable and what is not renewable. Need-based aid is not money that you get every year automatically. You have to apply for need-based aid by doing your FAFSA every single year. But merit scholarships or even some other types of scholarships might be renewable, and sometimes that's automatic, and oftentimes it's kind of based on a little bit on your grades. Okay, so make sure you find out about those things. Mary, is there anything that comes to mind for you that you want me to focus on before we kind of dive into a couple of these categories?
No, I think you've got it covered. Thank you, Mila. I would say the tuition payment plan was a significant, the monthly payment plan was very helpful when my sons, one is currently in college, but then also my previous son who graduated. So nothing to add, but just calling out one of the options that I think is really beneficial.
Okay, great. So we will push on them. So let's first talk a little bit about scholarships. And one of the things I want to mention right from the beginning is that you might feel like the scholarship ship has passed, but it hasn't. So there's this concept I think a lot of people think about senior year of high school. They do a lot of work around locating scholarships and applying for scholarships, but this is something you can continue to do all the way through. And for a matter of fact, some scholarships are specifically targeted to students who have already completed a year of college. So you just want to be sure that you are continuing to do that. So scholarships are simply free money that can pay for your education, and it's money that you don't have to repay. It could be awarded based on all sorts of things. So often there's some sort of merit or skill component to it. Maybe it is based at least in part on your family's financial situation, interests, talents, or background. Athletic money, to be honest with you, athletic scholarships, are based on obviously the student's athletic ability, right? So they can really run the gamut, and they're going to be very specific to you, and maybe even where you're from and what's available in your area. They can come from the schools, they can come from employers, community groups, or other organizations. And typically, scholarships can be used to cover tuition, fees, books, supplies, but scholarship money can be used in some cases. You need to check with the scholarship awarder, but in some cases, it can be used for your housing or it can be used for some of your other expenses. So you're always going to want to be sure, what the terms and conditions are. But those small amounts can really add up and ultimately, hopefully, not only get your bill paid, but maybe even reduce the amount that you have to borrow. And that's going to be really important when you get to the end of your schooling is to have borrowed as little as possible so that you don't need to repay more than you can afford to do. So I know sometimes the temptation, we had a scholarship today that we were talking about, and it's one that we work with, and we just don't have that many applicants. And so we're going to go back out, and I think it's in part because it's a relatively small scholarship, and people just feel like, oh, geez, is it worth the time and energy? But the reality is even a $500 scholarship, that's a lot of money. And sometimes those are the ones that are available because people don't apply for them. So, don't overlook those small ones because they can really add up. Now, we want to be sure that, when you're researching and you're applying for scholarships, that you only use free scholarship searches. I know not all of you are living here in Maine, but again, we do welcome you to use our website. And if you are from Maine, we absolutely want to be sure that you go to famemaine.com/scholarships and you learn more about scholarships. This is what that page looks like. And so over here, in the middle part of the page, this is where we do have a bunch of scholarships that are Maine based. So if you're from Maine, check those out. Most of them do require some connection to Maine. So if you're out of state, I'm afraid that section of the website isn't going to help you a huge amount, but there are other things on this page that we'd still want you to know about. And one of them is in our guide to finding scholarships, we have a tracking spreadsheet. So we have it as an Excel spreadsheet as well as a Google Doc. And we want to be sure that if you use that. So as I mentioned, you are not done applying for scholarships. You're not done searching for scholarships. You can start now to build your list of scholarships that you want to apply for next year. Or maybe there are still some that are available for this year. So this spreadsheet just makes it a little bit easier to stay organized. It allows you to list the name of the scholarship, the website, the amount, the criteria, the deadline, all of those important pieces. So that just makes it a little bit easier to log what scholarships look like a good match and then to help yourself stay organized when it comes time to apply for them. Scholarships can have deadlines that range the entire year. We tend to see that most scholarships are opening up and the application period is like December through March, but I will say there are others that absolutely go outside of those timeframes. The other thing that, regardless of where you're from, that we'd like to call attention to is we do have national scholarship searches listed on our website. And so anyone can look at those, but I just want to emphasize that you want to only use free scholarship searches. Any legitimate scholarship organization is looking to give away money. They're not looking to take your money. And so if they're asking for money, just move on. They are not going to find you something that you can't find yourself in a free search. I do see that we have a couple of questions. I'm going to just deal with this slide first, and then I'll pause and take a look at them, Mary, or you can jump in if it needs to be sooner. But the way I think to approach scholarship searching is to start local and then move outwards. Almost think of it like a bullseye, right? So start in the center first. And, you always want to talk to your high school. It may not be too late even now. Maybe there are some scholarships that are available through your high school guidance department that can still be applied for. So they are always a great source of a great source of information on scholarships. Your college might be another source. So what I found is with students, and Mary and I used to work at the University of Maine together before we worked at FAME together, and we had scholarships specifically from certain departments where they wanted the student to get a year or two under their belt, and they wanted to be sure they were going to be successful in school before they awarded scholarship money. So they put aside money specifically for students who were returning students. So make sure you talk with your department about that as you go through this process. Check with your employer or your parents' employer to see if they have anything available. At FAME, we do have a benefit that's available, not to our kids, but for ourselves. So sometimes employers will have money that can help you. McDonald's and Starbucks, for example, I know have scholarship programs available to their employees. Faith-based institutions, local civic organizations, local town offices, all of those are great places to look. Once you've kind of looked at all of the local stuff, because again, you're competing against fewer people that way and you're more of a known quantity, then you can broaden your search. And again, if you're in Maine, we want to be sure you look at our website. We also want to be sure if you're here in Maine that you visit the Maine Community Foundation's website. A community foundation, and you might have a community foundation in your state if you're outside of Maine. what they do oftentimes, they do many things, but one of the things that they will do is for people who want to create a scholarship, they don't know really how to go about that. They maybe don't want to actually deal with the administration of the scholarship. So a community foundation will do that on their behalf. They will help an individual or an organization get the scholarship set up and help them with the investment of the money and help them with the administration of that scholarship. So if you're not from Maine, make sure that you do a search on, community foundations in your state to see what's available. But in Maine, go to the Maine Community Foundation, and we link to it from our scholarship page. And then again, all of those national scholarships, here are just a few, but these are all legitimate ones. I'm not going to tell you, you might not get some emails from them as a way of them, following up after you've taken a few steps, but they're not going to charge you any money, and they do offer legitimate scholarships that can be very helpful. A little bit of time and energy to weed through them, but it really can be worth it. So I'm going to pause for a second and take a look at what's in the chat. Or Mary, you can just jump in if you.
Yeah, Sarah shared the FAME scholarship search tool and the scholarship tracker.
Perfect.
So just those two resources for participants.
Okay, well, that is great. Any questions from any of you about scholarships? Now, one of the things that you're going to want to do is make sure that you notify your school if you do have them, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. All right, another piece of that puzzle is to save. And, some of you might be in a situation where maybe someone started saving for higher education when you were a baby. Maybe you're one of the kiddos here in Maine that was born at Maine General in 2008 and has an Alfond scholarship. So there are all sorts of times during which people will start saving. And early is always great, but it's never too late. And every little bit that you save will be helpful. And I think the goal when it comes to saving has always been, it seems impossible to save everything that you might need. But again, if it's one of those pieces of pie, even a sliver of pie, it really can help make the difference. So thinking about your summer earnings and setting goals. When my oldest son was a senior in high school that summer that he graduated, I remember him having this conversation with me, and we talked a lot about money, and he'd been working at a job for a while, and I just said, here's your goal for the summer. I need you to save X number of dollars, because you need to buy your books and your supplies. You need to have your spending money when you go to school. And, he just, God love him. He's really good with his money now. He found a way. But back then, he was one of those kiddos that, he'd spent his paycheck before he'd worked his hours, right? So kind of evaluate who you are. Are you someone who is really good at saving? And that's great. Set the goal and you're going to meet it. Or is it a little bit harder for you? And so one of the little tricks that we try is if you're someone where it's a little bit harder to save, consider having some of your savings put into a bank account that you don't have easy access to. If you have easy access to your savings account because it's tied to your debit card, that sometimes can make it a little bit harder. But if it went into a building, a brick and mortar bank, and the only way you could get the money is to actually go to the bank, we find those little things can make a big difference and can make saving a little bit easier. Think about birthdays and holidays and graduation gifts. If someone says to you, my husband said to me the other day, what do you want for your birthday? Well, I'm not going to college right now, but if I was, one of the things I might say to someone in my life is, you know what? I'd love some money towards my schooling. And again, multiple people making even small, giving you small gifts can start to really add up. And then here in Maine, we do have a program called NextGen. It's one way that people can save for higher education. I will say people outside of Maine can open up a NextGen account, so it's not just limited to Maine residents. But if you are from Maine, one of the things that I did want to point out is that we do have some pretty awesome matching grants that are available if either the owner of the NextGen account or the beneficiary, who's typically the student of the account, is a Maine resident. For example, we have a matching grant where every dollar that gets put into your account gets matched at 30 cents on the dollar, up to $300 per year. So that can be a really big deal. And you can continue to do that all the way through school. I did it with my kids. I continued to contribute all the way through because at the end of the day, $300 made a really big difference. So you can check into that if that's something that you think you would want to learn more about. And then we talked a little bit about planning payment plans a moment ago. You might hear them referred to as tuition payment plans, but they really can cover all sorts of different education expenses. Like if you're living on campus, usually you can use your payment plan to pay for some of your housing. So, what payment plans allow you to do is just to break your payments down into smaller payments rather than making one lump sum. So, what's going to happen is like in late June, early July, depending on the school, you're going to get your bill for the fall. And it's going to be for the full fall semester, and it's typically going to be due in like August. And so instead of you have a balance left, instead of having to pay that full amount, you could break it up into monthly payments. And you get to decide how much they are. You don't have to pay all of your remaining balance that way. You can come at it at a different way, which is, what I can afford or my family can afford maybe to do a couple of $100s per month, and that will just pay down that balance sum. These plans are typically interest free. They're not loans, so you're not borrowing money and repaying it. But there usually is a small enrollment fee, and they tend to be pretty flexible. Some it's monthly, some it's by the semester, some it's for the full year. So what you're going to want to do is just see what your school offers, and usually the information about payment plans is going to be on the business office or the bursar's office. They sometimes go by different names, their section of the website. So sometimes it's on the financial aid pages, but oftentimes it's on the business or bursar's web pages where you'll find information about these plans. We just find they just make things more manageable. I remember my kids had braces, and if we had to pay for the braces all in one lump sum, that would have been just overwhelming, but breaking it down into smaller chunks just made it a little bit more manageable. And then when we talk about these other pieces, I've already mentioned for a moment that we do talk about federal student loans. So I just wanted to share a little bit more information on loans because for many people, they are part of the conversation. So we have federal student loans. These are funds that are lent by the federal Department of Education. And these are loans that you get yourself as a student who filed a FAFSA who is going to college. That's the criteria. So for a federal direct loan, it is not based on your credit history. It's not based on your income. It is because you are a college student who filed your FAFSA. But because of that, it is limited. So 5,500 is the most you can get as a first year student. It goes up to 6,500 typically sophomore year, and then 7,500 your last 2 years. So that is money that's available to you and you alone, and no one co-signs that loan for you. Now, the interest rates are usually pretty affordable, all things considered. These are the rates of 6.39 for last year. We'll have new rates sometime in May. We'll know the new rates for next year. And the way that it works is that each year when you borrow a loan, if you choose to do that, it will have a rate associated with it. And that particular year of loan, that will have that same rate all the way until you repay that loan. The next year, if you want to borrow again, there'll be a new rate for that new loan, and that will be the rate for that loan all the way through. So you want to pay attention as you're going to school, just kind of watching those rates, because typically what happens is you get done school and you have 4 loans that might have 4 different interest rates. Okay, so just kind of keep an eye out for that. Also, the benefit of federal student loans, and we usually recommend that if people have to borrow, you start with these loans first because they are a little bit more flexible. Specifically, they are more flexible when it comes to repaying them. Most loans, what they do is they say, here's how much you borrowed, here's how long you're going to have to repay it, and basically every month the payment is the same amount. But with federal student loans, there is the option to tie the payment amount to your income. So if your income's a little bit lower when you're starting out, your payment could be a little bit lower. So at the time of you going into repayment, you're going to want to investigate all of that, but that is one of the benefits. It's just there's some flexibility there, and there's even some forgiveness under certain circumstances. So you don't want to depend on that, but you do want to understand what options may exist. The federal government also makes Parent Plus loans available. These would be loans that your parent would borrow, not you. I am not crazy over these loans. I'm going to be honest with you. They have a pretty high interest rate. You can see that last year it was almost 9%. They take over 4% right off the top. And then when parents go into repayment, they only have the standard payment option. So, I'm not going to tell you that people don't borrow these loans. They are a loan that's a little easier to get when a parent may want to borrow. So people do look at them, but I would love to have you, if you need to borrow more than federal loans, look at other options. And I'm just going to share my personal opinion. I don't worry nearly as much about students who borrow federal loans because they are limited how much you can borrow. What we see is that students who stick to only their federal student loans and graduate from school, so they finish their program, typically find that repayment of those loans is manageable because they are limited. But what we see is that sometimes people tap into these other loans, these private loans. So these private loans are loans that are made available to people to pay for school, but they're very different than federal loans. So, for example, the loans are going to do what they call a debt to income ratio typically. They're going to look at credit score, at credit history, and these are loans that students cannot typically get on their own. As a 17, 18, 19-year-old student who hasn't, you've been in school, so you haven't been earning huge amounts of money. You might not have much of a credit history. You cannot get these loans on your own. So you're going to have a credit-worthy cosigner be willing to co-sign these loans for you. So they're a little harder to get because of that. And again, they don't have the same amount of flexibility. So some people will look at these options, but if you can avoid this option, that is the ideal situation, is to find a school where you don't need to pursue borrowing any of these private loans. For students who are here in Maine, either because you live here in Maine or you're going to go to school here in Maine, we do have something called the Maine loan. It is still considered a private loan, but it's structured a little bit differently in terms of how the interest rates are calculated. They're a little bit lower oftentimes than other types of private loans, but they are still loans that are credit-based and going to require a credit-worthy cosigner. Okay? Any questions about anything? I don't want to go too much in the weeds on loans, but at the same time, I want to be sure that we talk about it. Okay, is it possible to pay the federal loans while in college, or do you have to wait until you graduate college? You can. That's a great question, Sarah. You can pay on your federal student loans while you're in school, and there's no requirement to, but for example, some students, what they will do is they will at least pay their interest on their unsubsidized loan while they're in school, so that when they get done with school, their loan hasn't grown on them. It's the same as the amount that they borrowed. The only thing I would say, I think that it makes sense to pay down loans sooner rather than later in almost all circumstances. There are some options for forgiveness where it just is a conversation that before people are making payments on their federal student loans, I'd love to have a conversation, maybe not me personally, but I'd love to have them be sure that they know about public service loan forgiveness. And if they think they're going to go that route, then I probably wouldn't encourage them to pay on their loan while they're in school because it's just going to reduce the amount that could be forgiven. Okay? So much of things in this world are not black and white, so sorry about that. Any other questions? All right, here is a tool that I would love every single one of you to use and to share with your friends. And I will tell you that you might go through this and be like, oh my goodness, this is not what I wanted to see. Why did she tell me this? But what I just want to say to you is I'd rather have you use this tool and get a sense of the impact of borrowing before you borrow a penny than to have you realize kind of what things might look like on the other side once you've graduated. Okay, so this is a tool that's on our website. Again, we'd love to have you check it out, regardless of where you're from. And the tool lets you approach things in two different ways. So both sides are filled in here just so you can kind of see the example. But on the other hand, when you go to use it, you can just enter, you do one piece at a time. So let's just say, for example, you know what you're going to be doing, or you think you know what you're going to be doing when you're done school, and you know your expected salary is going to be about $52,000. On this page on our website, we have a link to an organization that I'm drawing a blank on, Mary, if you remember, which will help you know what salaries will look like. Career One Stop. There we go. If I just keep
I'm
talking too
just
much,
gonna
it's just
click and chime in. You got it.
Yes, Career One Stop, and that's a great website. I'd love to have you just check out in general. It's got so much cool information on it. But one of the things that you can do is say I want to be a nurse and I live in Bangor, Maine, and I want to live in Bangor, Maine. It can give me an estimate of what the average person makes in that particular job. So it's a really good idea to visit that website to just kind of get an idea of what you're going to earn. And, knowing that when you get out of school, your income's probably going to be lower than someone who's been working in that job for 10 or 15 years. So, kind of keep that in mind. But let's just say I went and I found out I was going to make 52,000. I put that in. I said that was my annual salary. Then what this tells me is, you know what? You probably shouldn't borrow more than about 31 or $32,000, right? Doesn't mean you can't, but it just means that if you can keep your borrowing to that amount, you're going to probably be able to pretty comfortably repay your loans without not being able to live your life and not being able to, do some of the other things you want to be able to do after you're finished with school. Okay. So if your salary is, lower than that and you're looking at borrowing more than that, you might want to be making sure those things are in sync. This is the one that I really would love to point out today. And this happened. Mary and I were on the same email today where someone reached out to us and wanted to have a conversation because a student was looking at borrowing $80,000 in loans for their education. So I went real quick and I did this calculator just as a quick, like, okay, can we just stop for a second and have a conversation about this? So in this scenario here, it's $50,000 per year. Okay. So if you're going to go to school and say, okay, I can borrow $50,000 per year, what I want you to know before you borrow anything is that, on average, using the rules of thumb and all the finance stuff that people spend a lot of time coming up with these numbers and calculators for, that you really need to be able to earn about $83,000 per year in order to comfortably repay $50,000 of student loan debt. Okay. So when I put that number in for that student that was going to borrow 80,000, off the top of my head, I think it was 133,000 or something like that. So, I'm not trying to be Debbie Downer, I promise. I just know that I would rather have you do this now before you get into debt than to, on the back end, realize, oh my gosh, not only can I not buy a house, which is really tough to do these days, I can't buy a car. I can't go out to dinner. I can't take a vacation. I want you to have a great time in college. I want you to go to a school that meets your needs. But there are many, many, many schools out there that can do that. What I don't want you to do is to be in a situation when all is said and done that your life in college was the best it's ever going to be. I want your life after college to be the life you dream of. Okay. So I'm going to get off my soapbox, but I just bear with me for thinking about things from that perspective. And again, I've got two boys of my own and we have these conversations. All right. So one of the last things I want to do is I want to share this worksheet with you. A couple more things, actually. I want to share this worksheet with you. This looks kind of similar to the one we use to compare financial aid offers, but this is one that kind of picks up after that. And what this work does is helps bring that piecemeal approach to life, right? So what you can see here is we figured out, what our cost was going to be, but then we can see if we plug in some scholarships, if we plug in some savings, if we plug in earnings for the summer or savings that are going to come from that, what families can contribute, remaining balances paid through tuition payment plans and things like that. So we can see how if we adjust those numbers, how we can get that remaining balance paid. And one of the things to keep in mind is that those pieces might vary depending on where you go to school. So there are some scholarships. If any of you are here in Maine, for example, and you've applied for the Worthington Scholarship, that's awesome. It's a fabulous scholarship. But if you're awarded that, you can only use it if you go to a Maine school. So just make sure that you understand when you're plugging in some of these numbers, especially the scholarships, where can and can't you use them. And, when you think about some of your other expenses, think about, where you're going to be living and what the impact of that is going to be. So we'd love to have you check that out and use that tool. I see a few things here. So let's see.
I think you've covered most of
Okay.
them, Mila. A couple
Okay,
are
great. You
just
guys are,
comments
yep, that's
about
good.
private loans being, loans being scary, especially private loans. Sarah had asked a good question about, is it better to consider payment plans before taking out loans? So I don't know if you want to talk about kind of
Yeah.
the combination of those two and when to seek one versus the other.
Yep. Um, for me, I think it depends on the family situation. I tend to be someone where I like to put the payment plan in first or in early, after the other types of aid. And sometimes, like as a parent, I will say, what I found is that when I didn't have my boys at home, and they were, living away from home, my grocery bill went down, my other things went down. So I actually had a little bit of extra money in my budget. And I realized that's not always going to be the case, but because they weren't taking 2 hour showers, that's an exaggeration. I did have a little bit of money that I could put into a payment plan. So I like to start with that. I do think that if you don't have to borrow every year, and actually, I'm not thinking about federal loans right now. Federal loans, you either borrow them in that year or you lose that eligibility going forward. So it's a little bit of a different thought process there. But for other types of loans, for example, if you can put off borrowing private loans for as long as possible, that's a good thing. So whether it's doing payment plans earlier, maybe it's using up some of your savings a little bit sooner. If that, for me, this is just my approach, if that means that if I can use maybe more of my savings, I use it in the first year, and yeah, I've depleted more of it. But then if I don't have to borrow, or I don't have to borrow until later, those loans won't be accruing interest as early. And so that in the long run can save me some money. Other people, if you don't have to borrow loans, one thing people might do is look at their savings and then divide it over 4 years. So I look at it a little bit differently depending on whether borrowing is involved. But with private loan borrowing, in my opinion, put that off as long as you possibly can because interest is going to be accruing from the moment that loan gets dispersed. Okay.
I think that's all for now, Mila.
Okay. Yeah, and I know it does feel scary, and I don't want us to, we're not trying to scare you. It's just you're at the point where you're making some really big decisions, and I want you to have all the information you need to make the decisions that are going to feel right for you, not just today, but again, 4, 5, 10 years from now. Okay, just a few more really practical things to talk about is the next steps that are remaining. So you've made huge progress, but you're not quite done yet. So just a few things to think about. Not all schools require you to accept your financial aid, but some do. So you kind of have to just check with your school and see, do I actually have to accept this aid? Sometimes they just assume you want your grants, of course, but others do formally require you to do that. So check your financial aid offer or check the student portal at your school to see what you have to do. With scholarships, be sure that you let them know, your school know if you've been awarded a scholarship. Here's what happens a lot of times with scholarships is that the scholarship organization is going to send a check to your school. The check's going to come into the business office. You're going to need to co-sign that check typically, and they're going to report it to the financial aid office. So the financial aid office is going to find out about your scholarship anyway. You're much better off to tell them about your scholarship sooner rather than later, because if you tell them about your scholarship, say in the summer, then maybe what they do is they adjust your work study. They reduce that and let you have more money that you don't have to repay. Or they take your loan and again, this is a little in the weeds, but they move your subsidized to unsubsidized so that you get more, again, money that you don't have to repay. Maybe they can recognize the purchase of a computer. If you're going to go purchase a computer over the summer, they may not know that, but if they recognize that expense, that makes more room for you to have that scholarship without adjusting your other aid. So it's really important to let them know as soon as possible so that as many options exist as possible and that it can work best for your situation. Now, when it comes to federal student loans, I do want you to know that you do not have to borrow the full amount that was offered you. So if you look and you see that you're offered 5,500 and you think, gosh, I think I can get by without borrowing that much, you can do that. So let's just say that you had 3,500 subsidized. That's the one that you don't have interest accruing while you're in school. That's the better one. And 2,000 of unsub, you absolutely could say to your school, hey, I want my 3,500 of subsidized, but I don't want my unsub. That's great. And you know what? They're not going to reduce your other financial aid because of it. I think sometimes people think, well, if I reduce my loan, are they going to think that I don't need this other aid? No, if you can reduce your loan, they too want you to reduce your loan. They don't want you to borrow any more than you absolutely have to. Now, the first time you borrow your federal student loan, you have a couple of additional steps. You don't do this every year. You just have to do it the first time you borrow. You're going to go back to studentaid.gov, the same place you went to file your FAFSA. You're going to log in with your username and password, the same thing that you did when you filed your FAFSA, and you're going to complete entrance counseling and sign your master promissory note. So right on that home screen, when you go to studentaid.gov and you log in, you're going to see there's a link to complete entrance counseling and to signing a master promissory note. Entrance counseling is just where you go through, a series of screens and they tell you about your loans and you have to demonstrate, that you kind of read the stuff and you understand your terms and conditions, when you have to repay your loans and just some of the things like that. It's really important that you understand that before you borrow, even though it's sometimes easy to skip reading that sort of boring information. They make it as engaging as possible, and it is really important. And then you sign a master promissory note. So this is a promissory note, just like if you bought a house or a car, you sign a promissory note saying you're going to pay it back. The easy thing, which is both good and bad with your federal student loans, is you just do this the first time you borrow. And then all of the rest of the way through school, you don't have to sign a new note every year. Master means that it's going to cover you for the next 10 years. If you change schools, you're just going to want to check in with your school. And then bottom line is that your funds, except for your work study, are going to be sent from the financial aid office over to the business office. The business office will have your charges up and your financial aid will reduce your bill, hopefully down to zero, but that's unfortunately not often the case. But it will reduce your bill down. If you do have a credit balance, so let's just say your charges in the business office, if you were going to school here in Maine and you were going to community college and you had a full Pell Grant and Maine State Grant, all of your tuition and fees are going to be covered by your Pell Grant and your Maine State Grant. You're going to have some money left over. They can release that to you, and you could use that to buy your books, to pay your rent and do things like that. So if you ever get in a situation where your financial aid exceeds the expenses at your school, the things they're charging you for, you can get that extra money and use it for other expenses. That happens most often four-year schools when students are living off campus, for example. So you're still going to pay your rent, but you're not being billed by the school. And then last but not least, I just wanted to talk about special circumstances or an appeal. We use those kind of interchangeably. If you filled out your FAFSA and you thought, oh my goodness, they don't get it, don't they understand that, our situation isn't the same as it was? You used information, you might not have actually seen it because the information from your taxes and your parents' taxes just kind of goes into the FAFSA without you being able to view it, but it used 2024 income. If your family situation has changed since 2024, if it's for the better, great, don't worry about it. But if, let's just say, you had a parent that has lost a job in the last year or so, you would want to reach out to the school. The school can take that into consideration. Or maybe, your parent still has their job, but their income is reduced because maybe their hours have dropped or something like that. If your parents were to get divorced or separated, you would want to let them know, meaning the school, know that that has happened so that they could figure out, what adjustments were needed to your FAFSA. I'm going to say this kind of tongue in cheek. Don't let your parents get married while they're, if your parents aren't currently married, don't let them get married while you're in college because it can impact your financial aid eligibility. Your family might have expenses that don't show up on the FAFSA but are really impacting the ability to pay for higher education. We hear families out there, and we know people who have really high medical expenses. The FAFSA takes that into consideration to some extent, but if you've got really significant medical expenses or other types of expenses that you don't have control over, like we call them non-discretionary expenses, then you can let your school know about that. Talk with them about your situation and see if there's anything that they can do. I always, always encourage you to talk to the people in the financial aid office, make a friend in the financial aid office, have them get to understand your situation. It will make it a lot easier for you as you navigate the next, 2 or 4 years in higher education. And that's what I had for you. Questions?
Mila, there was a quick question from someone about being unclear as to whether the scholarship was renewable.
Right.
And what is the best way to talk with the scholarship organization about
Yeah.
that? And they feeling a little leery about asking, financial money related questions.
hmm I want you to think about paying for higher education the same way you might think about, and I hate to buy a car, and I'm not good about asking these questions, but you are purchasing a product, okay? You are purchasing an education. So whether it's the financial aid office, or it's even a scholarship organization, these are big purchases, and you have a right to ask questions, and you should never. And I know I say this, and I know it's still hard for me sometimes, but you should never be shy about asking people for more information or to help you understand how something works, or if you can have more money. So I say all this all the time, right? And then when my oldest son was in school, we needed to do an appeal. And God, did I hate to call the financial aid office and ask them for more money. But I said, Mila, you say it to everybody else. You need to do it. And I did it. And we got more money. And that isn't always the way it turns out. But when it comes to a scholarship organization, these people have created these scholarships because they want to help you. And their goal is for more than to just give you money. They actually, most of them, have other goals as well. They want you to understand how all of this works. They want to support you in all sorts of other ways. So they are going to be very open to questions about, is this only for 1 year? Can I get money the next year? How much am I going to get? They welcome those questions. And if you know what, you run into someone who didn't welcome that question, then you ask to speak to someone else at that organization because that person's either having a bad day or something. Move on to the other person, okay? Because you have a right to have those questions answered, and I absolutely want you to ask them. Now, I will say what will be helpful is usually when a scholarship has been awarded, they send you a notification. So before calling them and asking the question, do pull out any notification letters and just read through them. So, like some scholarships, won't give you the money until you complete your first semester. And once you complete your first semester, you show them your grades, then they'll send the money. So it's really important to make sure that you review any correspondence from the scholarship organization. But if after reviewing that correspondence, you still have a question, or maybe you can't find the letter, you don't know what you did with it, just go ahead and call them. And people who work in those organizations, they expect those questions and they want those questions from you. Okay. Once you do it once, it gets way easier too. Is there any way I can have all of my 4 years of schooling up front, or is the tuition fixed each year, or is it dependent on the school? It is really dependent on the school in one sense. So all schools are going to charge you tuition on a year by year basis. For a matter of fact, most schools charge it on a semester by semester basis. But usually, what a school will do is like they will say, okay, here are upcoming rates for next year, right? So they're going to send you a bill for the fall and a bill for the spring, but usually their tuition is going to be the same for the fall and the spring semester, okay? They will have built their budgets and decided on the rate of tuition, by about now. So when you get your bill for summer, you can expect that if your credits are the same and everything else stays the same, that the bill will be about the same for spring. The next year, they're going to go through the process again. So it is possible that tuition will go up from 1 year to the next. And you have a right, that's another thing. You have a right to ask a school that. Do you anticipate that tuition is going to go up or my room and board will go up? And, I think I would hope that they would be honest with you and that often the answer will be, yeah, it could a little bit. Now, there are some schools out there that have programs where they commit to, they call it like a guarantee, and they'll all have different names, but they might guarantee that your tuition won't go up. So if you are a student who goes to a school that has one of these programs, if you enroll in that school and you stay there and you go full time, for the next 4 years, they may guarantee that your tuition won't go up. So it is kind of, it all depends on the school. So good question for the school, but I would say the vast majority of what you're going to see is that schools are going to bill you one semester at a time with the tuition rate being the same, usually one academic year at a time. I hope that wasn't too confusing, the way I answered that. Anything else? These are great questions. So, okay, good. Okay, wonderful. All right, then. What do you think, Sarah? Anything else that comes to mind for you based on the work that you do, or Mary, anything that I didn't talk about that I should have talked about? I mean, believe me, we can go on for a long time, and as much as we shared a lot, and I hope we didn't, go too deep, um, there's always more. So if you still have questions, we hopefully still have answers.
Um, I guess the first thing that comes to mind, because May 1st is this Friday, and a lot
It
of
is.
students are still on the fence on where they want to go.
Yeah.
If you had to leave them with one sort of advice, whether it be comparing financial aid, making the best decision for your future regarding
Yeah.
financial aid, or just like anything in general, I would love to kind of share that with them.
I think my piece of advice was to just dig into the details of your financial aid offer and make sure you've got a really good handle on what that school is going to cost you before you commit to it. Um, I can't leave you with just one. So that's one. Talking to the financial aid office, that's another. And then my third would be think about, as I mentioned a moment ago, your future self. I want you to envision yourself being 25 and 30, and I just want to be sure that you are setting yourself up so that you're not in a situation where financially you can't enjoy your life and have kids and buy houses and do that sort of stuff. And so that might mean in some cases that you've got two schools, and this is your number one school, and this is your number two school, but your number two school could be a really great school for you. You still really like number one. Just give thought to that. Give thought as to why, could number two really make you happy if it's a lot more affordable? And, the other thing I would say to people, yes, I can never just say one thing, is that, and this is what I had my son do. He went to a school that wasn't his first choice, his first year, and because his first choice was not affordable. And we actually said, guess what? So he went to a more affordable state school, had a really good year. He was a better college student than he was a high school student. And he did well enough that year that he was able to transfer to his other school and get some really, really good financial aid. So you are not locking yourself in forever by your choice. So don't stress too much either. And know that you can make a decision to transfer. I can't remember this. I think something like 40% of students transfer. So, try it out, and see what you think's going to work, but know that you're not locked in. You do have choices that you will continue to have each year. Okay?
Well, thank you both so much. Truly appreciate this. If any of y'all do have questions later, you can feel free to reach out to your coach or me, and we will gladly share it with our peoples from fame.
Yep, absolutely. You can always reach out, Sarah, and we'll help in any way that we can. That's okay.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you,
Well, nice
everyone.
to meet you all. Have a great evening. We'll talk soon, maybe.